इस डिक्लेरेशन को एडॉप्ट करने की घोषणा करता हूं।
Leaders recognized that they can have significant consequences for the global economy. In particular, they dwelt on the ongoing war in Ukraine and the impact it has had.
The most ambitious presidency in G20's history ever, because the number of outcomes it has, both the outcomes and the annexed documents are about 112. Which is more than 2.5 times which has ever been achieved before.
Welcome back. You're watching our continuing coverage here from the G20 Summit. I'm Shereen Bhan. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome on the program the World Bank head, Ajay Banga. Great to have you here on the channel back in India. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
You're making your G20 debut and we've got a New Delhi declaration. There were question marks on whether one would come through or not. Your first takeaway from this experience?
My first take is just the fact that that declaration did come through. You saw the articles and the burst of sort of cynicism around it. I actually think the Indian government managed to get and corral everybody to the right place. So I think it's actually a bit of a well done by the team, by Amitabh, the Sherpa, but of course by the External Affairs and the PM himself.
Yes, I would imagine there's a collective sigh of relief on just getting it done. But 83 paragraphs that deal with a whole host of issues, but para 48 to 53 deal with essentially what you're dealing with, which is reforming multilateral banks, which is the issue of dealing with current challenges, but more importantly future-proofing multilateral institutions for future challenges and future needs, repurposing, so to speak. Volume 1 done, recommendations done, will be taken up in October. Take me through where things currently stand on that front.
So I think there's multiple levels in this. When the G20 laid out the desire for an evolution of the Bretton Woods institutions, the logic, Shereen, was that what we've done for the past 78 years was great, but it's not future fit for what we need to go to. And so that was the idea. So for example, the vision of the bank was all around eradicating poverty and sharing prosperity. Very effective for many years by the efforts put in by so many countries. Jobs got created. That's what lifted people out of poverty. COVID and the pandemic and climate change has changed that. So clearly we've got pandemics, we've got climate change, we've got fragility in a war, you've got what happened with food prices, so there's food insecurity, biodiversity loss. When you put all that together, the bank cannot stay focused on trying to solve for poverty without expanding the aperture that it looks through to include these poly crises, because they're impacting each other. And I think that's the first big change. It enables the people in the bank and the vision of the bank and the mission of the bank to go broader. Inside that, we've created a real focus on women and young people. Why women? Because half the world is female, and even today in 2023, it's inadequately represented either in management or in the labor force or in compensation or in opportunity at all levels of society across the world. This is not a country-specific issue. And the young people, because the global south is full of young people, and young people are a demographic dividend if you give them quality of life when they're growing up, education, health, clean water, and then you give them jobs. So we try to focus on those two. And then there's the whole issue of how can we work better with other multilateral institutions. I just announced a very big partnership with the Inter-American Development Bank, something that people had not done. But we're going to collaborate on the Amazon, on climate issues in the Caribbean, and on digitizing, a subject close to your heart in India, digitizing governance in Latin America. So it's how you work with other multilaterals, but most importantly, how we work with the private sector. There just is not enough money in balance sheets of MDBs or governments or philanthropy to kind of make the numbers come about. If you listen to people say you need $1 trillion a year in the emerging markets for renewable energy, I mean, there's not enough money in these balance sheets. So you have to find a way to get the capital and the ingenuity of the private sector in. That's why we've got this private sector lab with Mark Carney and Shriti Vadera and 15 CEOs from asset management companies, and Chandra from Tata's is on it, and so on. That's the idea. That's the stage we're at. It's a process. There's a lot going on inside this sausage getting made, but it does require also focus on capital and sweating the balance sheet. From your loan to equity ratios to hybrid capital, portfolio guarantees, green public goods funds, that kind of stuff.
So let me try and unpack this sausage and break this up into the critical issue that you spoke of. Where is the capital going to come from? In terms of the bank itself, the revision of the capital adequacy framework and what room or headroom that opens up for you. Let's talk specifically about the headroom for the bank and then the private sector participation and the leverage that you hope that will be able to fund some of these issues that we spoke of.
So just the loan to equity ratio creates about $50 billion of additional lending over the course of the decade. Those announcements that are coming out right now, what the U.S. government has put into the request to Congress, creates another $25 billion over the decade. Germany announced some things today. Others are in the pipeline. By the time our annual meeting happens in Marrakesh, we're thinking that all this put together could get us to between $100 and $150 billion of lending. Now, keep in mind, we do about $120 billion of committed lending every year. So this is important, but it's not going to change the world.
Yeah, it's incremental. It
is incremental, and that's the idea. The idea is to sweat the balance sheet and make it work harder. But there's things you can do. If you originate to distribute in our IFC, then you can leverage the balance sheet over many times again. That work is internal and is beginning as we speak. Then there'll be the issue as we go along. I call this the better bank. If I do what I need to do with the mission and vision, if I do what I need to do with capital adequacy framework, I do what I need to do with how the bank works, then the question is, should we go for a bigger bank? Because then the question that faces the richer world is, what's the limit of your ambition on how you want to drive change in the developing world? And I think you should expect that to be the next conversation at some point of time. A little bit down the road, once you've got this bigger bank idea ready based on having a better bank in the bag. That's where I'm going.
So the journey from bigger to better, or better to bigger, or better to bigger, what is the aspiration? And I know that this is a work in progress and a work in process, but what is the aspiration given the needs that the world faces?
Well, the G20 expert group put out aspirations. They talked in terms of hundreds of billions of dollars of additional capital into the multilateral banks. I don't know if that's going to come, because it's not as though the world has got a great deal of fiscal headroom right now to be able to do this. Would this change in a year or two? It could. So I don't know. My approach to the N.K. Singh, Larry Summers report is to take it in, understand it, and say, let's get the better bank going. Let's create the room and headroom for asking for the bigger bank, which is what I'm doing. But meanwhile, let's get going with the private sector. Because, Shereen, even if we get $100 billion more capital, you're not going to get what you need for the kind of things we're discussing, from renewable energy to agriculture and methane to transportation to what we need to do with carbon capture. This is just in the climate space. Now let's talk poverty alleviation. Then let's talk pandemics, and then let's talk fragility and refugees. So there's a lot to be done here. The idea that somehow this will all come from multilateral banks or the generosity of the richer world, I don't think you should do that. I think you should view that as seed capital, as the foundation on which the private sector must come.
So what is the role then that you expect the private sector to play, since you talk about the fact that governments around the world as well as multilateral agencies find themselves fiscally challenged and fiscally constrained? What is the role, what is the expectation, the ask of the private sector that you have?
We should not make it only about the money. I can tell you that right now, if you were to give me a great deal of money to use in some of the emerging markets, finding bankable projects in countries where people are willing to take that risk is not that easy. There's work to be done between here and there. So it's also, it's a supply and demand situation. Most conversations end up about the capital supply. Actually, it's a little bit of both. One of the things the private sector can do really well with multilateral institutions and the like is to get more bankable projects on the ground. We need to help them do that. For example, we can advocate, and we do, for regulatory policy certainty. One of the things the private sector loves is to have an idea and a roadmap of where things are going with tariffs, where things are going with negotiating with the utility, where things are going with foreign exchange or with guarantees, right? First loss in some cases. So I think there's things that the multilateral institutions and governments can do to make it easier, more palatable, more predictable, more consistent policy for the private sector. But then the private sector has to work with us to create bankable projects. So I think there's those two roles, even before you get to the capital that the private sector can bring.
You know, I want to talk about what you brought up, and that's a big focus here, digital public infrastructure.
Yes.
And the World Bank has put out a report on how it believes that this digitization journey that we've seen in India has actually aided financial inclusion through the Jam Trinity, through now things like the UPI, etc. The significance of this, the exportability of this in being able to address some of the challenges that we just spoke of.
So I think the interesting part about this, and it's happened in a few more countries, it's not just in India, but India is a shining example because of the size and scale of what was done over the last couple of decades, starting with the identification scheme all the way to building the basic platform and then building the applications on top. My view is that if you look at the technology stack, the brilliance of this wasn't that. You create fundamental foundations that are common and you make those global public goods. So you price them at a price which enables people to come in on top with apps. So it's interesting, it's not just the government. In many ways, I think what Jio has done, along with what Airtel is doing today with all the pricing on cellular, is actually to create a very wide distribution of phones and data plans across the country. And then the money can be made on the applications that get built on it, rather than on the data itself. And so I think there's a lot of intelligence in this model and stack that can be used. I do think that you have to be careful about ensuring that we update it for the latest technology. A lot of this work began years ago. We've got to be sure we are really good on cybersecurity and privacy. The world today on cybersecurity and privacy is different from 15 years ago. So there's a lot of good work done here and a lot of great things in the model. And I'm very supportive of that model being usable.
Ajay, Banga, I have a lot more to ask you, but I know we don't have time at all this evening, but it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for giving us time and speaking to us today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Well, we are going to take a break. There's a lot more coming up. Don't go anywhere. We continue our coverage here from the G20 Summit right after this.